Hello all, my name is Andrew, and I'm from a very rural town in Oklahoma, the town of Carmen. I am 24 years old, and all of this happened back when I was 22. There isn't a whole lot going on in my hometown, so whenever there's something that causes the tiniest bit of excitement, it feels like the entire community gets involved. The town started getting all worked up once domesticated dogs started to disappear from our properties. It was always dogs that were left to roam their respective yards that it seemed like ended up vanishing into thin air. There were never any bodies found, which led a lot of people to believe that someone was going around stealing dogs that they suspected might have been abused and needed a better home. But it got to the point where it started happening so regularly that this theory started to dissolve. The population of domesticated canines was dropping so rapidly that people who still did have their dogs started to keep them inside nearly 24 hours a day. I remember there was one man who claimed that he saw a devil leap into his neighbor's yard and snap their dog's neck, and then run off with the body in an instant. There were a handful of very religious folks who seemed to believe this claim. However, many others began to acknowledge him a little more as just a crazy old man. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he would be woken up by the firing of a rifle. It wasn't like that had never happened before. After all, coyotes were frequent in the area, and sometimes folks would fire a shot into the air just to scare them off. But this started happening at such a high rate that people who never had any dogs of their own started to complain about all the noise. The disappearance of these dogs created so much controversy amongst the residents within the town. The mystery had gone on for so long that there had become this unwritten rule to refrain from even speaking of it. But unfortunately, that didn't prevent the horror from continuing. I had this one very close friend. We'll call her Kristen. And she had become very intrigued in the matter. She was this cool, butch individual who shared many of the same interests as me while growing up. She called me over one day because she claimed to have seen the animal that she suspected was responsible for the dog abductions. She had been trying to capture both photographs and footage of the animal, but, as you might expect, it never really worked out. Kristen invited me over to her place one night to kick it and wait for this animal to appear. I remember I wasn't all that interested, for whatever reason, but she was able to persuade me with a 6-pack of beer. Shortly after I arrived there, I watched Kristen's older brother place a bunch of raw strip steaks in various places around their backyard. The three of us had a good time that night, but we saw nothing. I believe it was the following weekend when I went back and did a similar routine, only this time her brother thought it would be a better idea to hang the meat from a few large trees that you could see from their backyard. We had a few beers and were sitting around the space near one of their windows that was lit by nothing more than a handful of candles. It wasn't even that late in the night that we saw movement near the trees. At first, I thought we were looking at a mere coyote. A large one, but a coyote nonetheless. It was when we watched it stand up on 2 feet and extend an arm way above its head to grab the strip steak that I immediately knew this was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Kristen's brother Jim explained that he hung the meat high up there so that it would instantly prove that this was no normal dog. Unlike other encounters I've heard or read, this creature didn't appear overly muscular or anything like that. From where we were sitting, I don't think it was any larger than the average adult man. Because of all the other reports talking about how massive these things can get, I wouldn't be at all surprised if what we were looking at wasn't maybe a juvenile. In a way that almost makes it more frightening. If it was a juvenile that was capable of capturing and likely consuming that many dogs, Imagine what a full-grown adult dogman would be capable of. I've never seen one of those, and I certainly hope I never do. We watched the supposed juvenile animal for a few minutes before it scampered away. Each of us was shooting footage and snapping photos with our phones, but all of it was too dark to use as proof unless you knew what we were looking at to begin with. Jim didn't set up any lights near the trees at the time because he had convinced himself that a light setup would drastically decrease the chances of being able to attract the animal. So the animal was there, biting at the meat for just a few minutes, and sniffing around the area before it eventually wandered off back into the dark. It wasn't much longer after that people seemed to stop seeing this creature, and the remaining dogs stayed out of harm's way. I'm sure a lot of that is because people were exercising caution by keeping their dogs closed, and inside most of the time. Therefore, the animal might have become discouraged by the lack of available food, compared to what was once available, and decided to move to a different area. I strongly believe that it was a rare type of hominid that I saw that night. But there were a few people that I knew out there who were convinced that it was just a spirit of some kind. I think that might have been due to the fact that they all had so much trouble capturing any type of image of the creature, even when it was in plain sight. But there is plenty of documented wildlife out there that is also very challenging to photograph, even for professionals. Sure, they're not quite as challenging, but if there are very few of these dogmen roaming this earth, it's understandable why it's no easy task. That's all I've got. My name is Stan. Thank you for sharing my story. I really didn't know where else to send it. I first wanted to say thank you for taking the time to read my story. My name is Sid, and I had an encounter with the creature while conducting Sasquatch research up near Mount Rainier. I was never intimidated by the idea of crossing paths with a Sasquatch, but I'm confident that many others will agree that running in with a dogman is an entirely different story. I've been interested in Sasquatch ever since I was a child and saw the famous Patterson-Gimlin footage. When I saw that, it was as if it brought life to a brand new person, sparking a passion that I had never felt before. I lived just outside of Seattle at the time, and on the weekends would beg my mother and father to take me out into the national park so that I could search for footprints. Yeah, I was that kid. I should mention that I've seen Sasquatch more than once, but it's always been from a very great distance. I've never been close enough to one of them to make out facial features, or smell the air of their breath, or anything of the sort. That's why I think it's more interesting that I encountered this other, even rarer creature up close. It was around the beginning of summer in 2005 when I decided to head out on a solo expedition. I usually went with a friend or two, but both of the guys who were interested in the subject were busy on this particular occasion. I didn't always do things this way, but I remembered it had been a while since I went camping. So I decided to go all out and go on a backpacking excursion that took you on something like a 10-mile journey. I always like to take my time with these kinds of journeys, because I'm a firm believer that this is a subject you have to be more patient with than many other things in life. Some people think I'm loony for saying this, but I don't think you can expect to do good Sasquatch investigating while you're frantic with energy. I do think that this species can sense that sort of thing. Now that's just my opinion, and I've been doing this stuff for many years, and it's consistently been the case where I've found tracks and other signs of their presence when I'm feeling centered, but not at other times. The more frantic I am, or the more stressed, the less I've found. Of course, it could just be because my awareness is improved when I'm centered. Therefore, I notice more of my surroundings than at any other time. It's up to you to decide, but that's my opinion. It was the second night of my hike, and the sky was so beautifully clear, but I decided to take my chances with unforeseen bad weather and removed the rain guard from the top of my tent. I had been asleep for some time, although I'm really not sure for how long, and I was woken by the sound of these unordinary breaths that seemed to be coming from somewhere very close to my tent. These breaths were so raspy that I got the impression whatever was responsible for them was very sick, possibly even on the verge of death, because it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. I, of course, speculated whether it was a Sasquatch that was snooping around my camp. The area I was in was known for frequent activity, which is why I was there, and of course I got pretty excited. A bit nervous, but excited nonetheless. I continued to lay there on my back as still as possible, listening to everything that was going on outside the wall of my fabric shelter. I could hear it sniffing the little area where I had built a fire to cook my freeze-dried food. I was quite intrigued until I watched the silhouette of a gigantic hand run its fingers along the outer wall of the tent. The moonlight was just enough to provide me with a visual of the shape of his hand. Now, I've always believed Sasquatch to be potentially dangerous, if in a position where it was to feel threatened. But I quickly realized that this was no Sasquatch. On the tips of the fingers there were very long nails. Nails that were far too long to be considered fingernails. These were claws. When it lightly brushed these claws against the fabric, the animal must have been in a position where it was nearly lying down, because soon after that I could see the silhouette of the figure rise and peek up over the top of the tent. Now, since I didn't have the rain guard on, I got a damn good look at this thing's face. It was horrifying. Even though it was dark outside, my vision was adjusted enough to see the whites of its eyes, and the bright white and yellow teeth that lined the extensive snout. I watched as those jaws opened wide and let out a very sick-sounding inhale and exhale. It was at this moment that I realized I was terrified. I don't think I could have moved, even if my life depended on it. This Dogman looked so evil, so sinister, and so predatory that I convinced myself I was a goner. I believed I was going to die, and I was trying to get ready for the death. It seemed like any split second that it was about to lunge at me through the screen of the tent and instantly shred me into little morsels. I can't tell you how long we stared at one another, but it felt as though I was holding my breath the entire time, bracing myself for the imminent agony. Suddenly its head swiveled in a different direction, and it instantly moved out of sight. It had to have rapidly left the area, because I never heard another peep from it. I just continued to lay there, wide-eyed as ever, staring up at the screen of the tent, up into the sky, until it lit up with morning. This might surprise many, but I did end up completing the hike within the next 2 days, and even proceeded to continue with my investigations. The only difference was that I started keeping an eye out for something other than Sasquatch. I believe I was able to find peace with what happened since I was inches away from the beast, and wasn't attacked. Didn't even try. When I've told other investigators about what happened that night, they tend to ask me if I'm certain I wasn't dreaming. Imagine that. We're talking about people who conduct regular Sasquatch research that treated me as if I was delusional. It's not everyone, only a select few, but I think it serves as a fine example of how people ridicule each other, even amongst the believer community. There is so much more to this world than many of us feel comfortable enough to even believe, even those of us that call ourselves believers. This encounter took place in the area of Watersmeet, home of the famous Paulding Lights phenomenon, back in 1994. Oddly enough, the Paulding Lights are also known as the Dog Meadow Lights. I was 13, had just gotten new rollerblades for Christmas, and since the main road where our property site sits is paved, I couldn't wait to ride around. I went blading by myself and stopped to rest for a second. On this road, the woods are so thick, there's not much space between the road and the woods on most part. And I remember seeing the trees pushed down along the road that my dad said was done by bears. He was an avid bear hunter. I remember not hearing any of your normal sounds of nature, not even birds. The air was still, and the sky would be pure dark not too long. I was deciding to turn back when I heard a rustling behind me, and something emerged from the left side of the road. I assumed it was a deer, and paused and made myself as quiet as I could so I could watch it. I then slumped down on my stomach in the middle of the road. It was about 600 feet ahead of me. When I got myself settled in the road to watch it and looked up, I realized that what I was looking at was no deer. It was on all fours, with gray or brown fur. At first, I feared the worst, thinking a bear had caught my scent, until I saw its outline and color. I thought I was looking at a dog until I realized the face was too primitive, like a fox or a coyote. At this point in my life, I had never seen a wolf in actual real life, and it was too far for me to make out the face exactly. It extended its front legs, and in the slowest, longest seconds of my life, stood up onto its hind leg, sniffed the air, walked about 5 steps, then got back down on all fours and walked to the other side of the woods, and then just disappeared. I don't remember how long I laid in the middle of the road, staring into the empty space I had just seen this thing stand like a human. I remembered my jaw hanging down as low as it could, and even a pool of drool on the cement under it. It finally clicked in my mind that perhaps I should rollerblade my butt back to camp as quickly as I could. In the fall of 2008, my son and I were driving on US 41 towards 3 lakes in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which is where I live. This beast ran across the highway near Tioga Creek. I had not heard of this before, but this is exactly what we saw. We are familiar with all animals living here. Moose regularly cross in front of the drivers, so we watch the sides of the roads carefully. A moose is too large and the last thing you want to hit, so we really are very careful and very observant. We were very puzzled and thought it might be some kind of mutant wolf. Could not figure out what we had witnessed. It ran fairly fast, about 50 feet in front of the truck. It was so strange because the front of it was much higher up than the back. It was far larger than a wolf. It was terrifying. It was incredibly fast. It looked incredibly mean, and I'll never forget it. On I-75, a couple of 100 yards south of the Bay Road overpass in Mackinac County, I noticed something moving near the highway reflectors. Thinking it was a deer, I turned on the bright lights and watched for it to cross the road. As I approached it, I noticed that what I thought was the reflectors on the highway was orange, and then it blinked on and off like an eye. Thinking, what the heck is that? I sped up to get closer, and as I got closer, I could see the silhouette of this animal. It was sitting like a dog. Its head was even with the reflectors. It stood on all fours, and turned and walked down into the ditch, and then up a little incline, then turned and looked back at my truck. It turned back to the highway, walked on all fours onto the shoulder of the blacktop, looked at the truck again with those orange eyes. The eyes were huge. It then jumped to within a foot or two of the center line, and then the next jump landed on the grass on the shoulder of the road on the opposite side. I was probably less than 100 feet from it. This animal was rippling with muscles, and it looked like it weighed at least 500 pounds, if not more. Its hair, which covered its body, looked short, and its head was huge, with hardly no neck. After I passed where it crossed, I hit the brakes, as there were no cars on the side of the road, and I started to back up. As I got close to the spot where it had crossed, I suddenly felt immense fear and thought, what the hell am I doing? I put the truck back in drive and began to leave. As I was rolling the window up, I glanced back and noticed a light bright like a floodlight, ascending into the sky at a high rate of speed. It was at an angle of about 1 o'clock, and in just a few seconds it was out of sight. It's just something else that was strange was there. No other light rays were trailing it. It was just a light, a strange dog, and stuff I can't explain. My name is Kevin, and this sighting happened in 2010. We got maybe 300 yards back from the walk we were taking, and started hearing heavy breathing and snapping sounds in the thick brush to our right. We thought maybe coyotes, but we got to a corner and were stopped in our tracks. In front of us, maybe 60 yards away, was something blacker than the woods, standing on 2 feet. It stood between 6'8" and 7'4". We slowly turned away and backtracked. But before we got back to the field, the same thing was in front of us again. We turned around for a second and then turned back, but it was gone. When we got back to the field, we noticed that there were 4 or more of these creatures, one on each corner of the field, just standing there. We saw one move halfway behind a tree. At this point, we were freaking out. It seemed like we were being stalked, or possibly just toyed with. We made our way back through the field and got to the edge, and there was one standing directly in the middle of the trail which entered the woods. We hauled butt back home, and the whole way we felt like we were being watched or stalked. We have been out every night since then. We have learned not to use lights because it comes closer than 60 yards. The closest it's been was maybe 25 yards, and it was still moving closer. As long as we don't have lights, they do come in and they get pretty close. It happens frequently. At one point I shot at it. There were a total of 5 of these things we saw that first night, and after the time I shot at one, we haven't seen them act quite as nonchalant. They've been much more aggressive. We went out last night and there was only 4, but again they seemed far more aggressive. One of them beat its chest, another beat a tree, another one was taking a stick and slamming it against the ground. The strength that you can hear from these creatures is absolutely staggering. You can feel the bass of the beating echo through your body. In the field, it seems like they tried herding us into a corner. I think they're hunting us. We're probably going to stop walking altogether. Back in 1975, I was on a canoe. There are many trails that run through here in this place we call the Sandies. We were all young kids and we would go and party. My dad and 2 of his buddies were in a canoe in broad daylight paddling from the Sandies around the back of the cemetery. We were following in a similar canoe. The banks of the river are 10 to 12 feet high in places, and some trails run right to the edge. All 4 of us saw what looked to be like a big dog running behind us on the trail. We were in the canoe, and it was following along the trail. We didn't pay much attention to it until we heard a large splash. When we looked, it was in the water and swimming after us, and it went from a dog paddle to the chest and front legs coming out of the water and wading after us. It was pounding through the water with ferocious speed. We decided right then and there not to wait around and see what it was. We all paddled faster than we ever have in our lives, and I'm very happy to say that we lost it quickly behind us. I wasn't going to turn around. All I did was paddle. I got one good look at it, and it was basically a werewolf. I've never seen anything like it, and I pray to God I never see anything like it again.